All right, it's just gone 3:03, so let's get started. My name's Sally McAdams, for anybody who has never met me before. I coordinate Climate Emergency Australia, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how you can connect with us a little bit later on today. But we're going to start off, as always, with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge that I myself personally am joining from Wurundjeri land today and pay my respect to their elders, and also pay my respect to the elders of all the First Nations around this country and from all the land that you're joining from today, and just acknowledge that they really have been looking after this country for countless generations, and also extend that respect to elders and other members of First Nations who are here with us today. So I mentioned before, just in case you're new here, this is a Climate Emergency Australia webinar co-hosted today with Communities for Climate Compensation, and I'm going to introduce Millie and Co in just a moment. But CEA, if you haven't come across us before, is a network of Australian councils who have declared a climate emergency, and also just councils who are responding to the climate emergency. So in a moment, we're going to hand over to Amelia Anthony from Communities for Climate Compensation. We'll also hear from Councillor Elia Haig from Byron Shire Council, and also John Brennan, who's a team convener on the Sunshine Coast. And John, I heard, was one of the people who actually agitated to get the climate emergency declaration there in the Sunshine Coast. So that's a lovely connection to have him here today. So I think without too much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Millie now. Let's make sure you're able to come off mute, Millie.
I think so.
Yes,
hello.
you're all good.
Yeah, great.
All right, take it away, Millie.
Great, thank you, Sally. Hi, everybody. My name is Millie. I am an organiser at an organisation called Tipping Point, which is a really small organisation that supports grassroots networks and teams of volunteers to run community-led campaigns. I'm based on Awabba land. I'm in Mullumbimba or Newcastle in New South Wales. And Sally, if you could move the slide forward, I want to pay my respects also to the elders that are here on the country that I live and work on. And I also wanted to thank Climate Emergency Australia for hosting the webinar and giving us a chance to chat about the Communities for Climate Compensation Network, our new campaign and the new network that's formed. Because our community network and campaign has taken a lot of inspiration from the incredible work that the councils have done to declare climate emergencies across Australia. And as Sally mentioned, you'll hear a bit later that there is a lot of a crossover between some of the teams that encouraged councils to declare their own climate emergencies, like John, who are now leading campaigns as part of the Communities for Climate Compensation Network. So I'm going to start by briefly putting this campaign in the context that we're all operating in. So Sally, if you can move the slide. So climate impacts, as I know that you all know, is someone having, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Sorry to the person who put that in the chat, looks like it's just you. We all know that climate impacts are no longer a future concern. Communities are experiencing floods, fires, storms, heat waves, coastal erosion and drought, and it's happening right now. And climate disasters are estimated to cost Australia around $38 billion every year. Slide please, Sally. And those impacts are landing during a cost of living crisis. And we know households are under pressure from housing, groceries, insurance and rates, while governments at every level face growing demands on limited budgets. And at the same time, politics has become increasingly polarised, and many people feel that governments and institutions are not keeping pace with the challenges that are affecting their lives. Slide, please, Sally. But beneath that polarisation, there is a strong and widely shared concern about fairness. The communities are being asked to carry rising costs, while some of Australia's largest and most profitable organisations and corporations continue to receive substantial tax concessions and public subsidies. And in the meantime, Australia remains one of the world's largest exporters of coal and gas. We're not yet on track to meet our emissions reduction commitments, and the industries that are driving a significant share of global emissions continue to generate substantial profits. So the question at the heart of this campaign is really simple. As the costs of climate change rise, who should pay? Communities and councils, or the polluting corporations contributing most to the problem? If you can move the slide, please. So the answer, as you well all know, to who currently is paying is unfortunately at the moment councils and the communities that they serve. Slide, please, Sally. Climate change is a national and a global challenge, but many of its impacts are managed locally. Between 2019 and 2023, 434 of Australia's 537 councils experienced at least one climate-related disaster. And since 2020, 346 councils have experienced 2 or more climate disasters. And the National Climate Risk Assessment also makes clear that this is no longer confined to traditionally disaster-prone regions. As the climate continues to warm, communities with little previous experience of major disasters will increasingly be exposed. And so the financial problem is that council revenue is not keeping pace with these costs. Over the past 20 years, the slides are gone. Sally, if you could pop the slide back.
Sorry, I just needed to reshare because something happened. It wasn't looking correct.
Oh, all good.
Let's try that again.
I have a fun graph for you all. It's not at all fun. That demonstrates this financial problem, that over the past 20 years, insured disaster losses have increased 12-fold, while local government revenue has increased only 3-fold, and that gap is widening. So slide, please, Sally. We can see the consequences across the country. For example, Shoalhaven City Council experienced 14 disasters in 5 years. It exhausted its cash reserves and is facing a projected $35 million budget shortfall. For example, in Macedon Ranges, the council spent $21 million responding to a single storm and about 1/5 of its annual budget, and then waited 3 years for reimbursements. In the Blue Mountains, damage for one weather event cost more than twice the council's annual operating expenditure to repair. And these pressures, as we've just heard, are often most severe in regional, remote and lower income communities, which may have fewer staff, smaller revenue bases and less capacity to absorb these repeated shocks. And just unfortunately, we keep hearing these are not isolated cases. They show a funding system under extreme strain. And so councils are being forced into choices that you all know extremely well. Money that would otherwise, slide please, Sally, maintain roads, parks, libraries and community services are diverted into disaster response and recovery. Some councils respond by drawing down reserves or delaying services and infrastructure. Others are forced to increase rates or introduce special levies. Others must compete for funding programs that are oversubscribed, administratively demanding and often slow to reimburse costs and create serious cash flow pressure. And at the same time, communities expect councils not only to recover, but to prepare for what comes next. And councils also want to rebuild infrastructure to a higher, safer standard, but disaster funding is often designed to replace what was damaged rather than fund the additional cost of building back better. And the result is a structural funding problem. The current local government funding model, as you all know, was not designed for a future in which disasters are more frequent. Adaptation is essential, and councils are expected to fund both recovery and resilience. So this is the key question. If councils and ratepayers can't continue absorbing these growing costs, what would a fairer and more sustainable funding model look like? Slide, please, Sally. So this is where our campaign and proposal comes in, and it is deliberately simple. We want to establish a national climate compensation fund funded by a levy on Australia's major coal and gas export corporations. The revenue would be earmarked, so rather than disappearing into consolidated revenue, it would be dedicated to helping communities respond to the impacts of climate change. And importantly for local government, for you all, the fund would include a dedicated funding stream for councils to meet the growing costs of disaster recovery, resilience, and also adaptation. But the fund would also support other communities carrying a disproportionate share of climate impacts, including funding for First Nations Climate Adaptation Fund, support for Pacific loss and damage, and assistance for workers and communities through the energy transition. Slide, please, Sally. And the proposal is for a fund of around $46 billion each year, because that is the scale of the challenge that is required, and we need a response to match the scale. And so, just as importantly, the levy would apply to major export producers rather than being designed in a way that could increase household energy bills. And so as fossil fuel exports decline over time, the levy would increase to maintain a stable funding source while also strengthening the economic incentive to transition away from fossil fuels. So in other words, it would provide a long-term funding source for the growing costs communities are facing, while helping Australia move towards a lower emissions economy over time. And for councils, we appreciate that this solution isn't simply another funding program. It's an opportunity to establish a structural funding solution that better reflects the reality that local government is now managing every day. So slide, please, Sally. And so a question that we're often asked is whether this idea resonates beyond just people who are already engaged about climate change. And the evidence suggests that it does. In preparing this campaign, and since it launched in March of this year, volunteers have had thousands of conversations across regional communities, outer suburbs and cities, including most people who just absolutely would not describe themselves as either politically engaged or climate alarmed. And then again and again, where they are reporting back the same underlying sentiment that people understand climate impacts are costing their communities more, and they don't think local residents should be left carrying these costs alone. And so when the issue is framed around fairness, that industries contributing to the problem should also contribute to fixing the problem, people from very different political backgrounds are willing to engage. And that experience is also reflected in polling. Slide, Sally. The national polling conducted by the Superpower Institute in January of this year showed that around 7 in 10 Australians support a levy on major polluters to help fund community needs. And slide, polling by the Redbridge Group in February 26 also found that the majority support for a levy on gas exports across voters from very different parts of the political spectrum, including Greens and One Nation voters, still remained high. And that matters because what we're putting forward here is not just a climate policy, it's a proposition about fairness, a responsibility, and protecting communities. And those values really resonate beyond traditional environmental constituencies. And so, slide, that's why in March this year, we launched the Communities for Climate Compensation Network. In just a few months, the network has grown to more than 50 local teams that are active across more than 80 council areas in every state and territory. And these teams are having conversations with residents, businesses, sporting clubs, faith groups, and community organisations about the impacts they're seeing locally, and also the kinds of solutions that people want to see locally. And often, by the time councillors are considering a local motion, they can see that it reflects a genuine community concern. And so These teams have been working really constructively with councillors and council staff because we see local government as a critical partner, because councils are clearly amongst the most impacted stakeholders, but also the most credible voices calling for a better national funding system. And so we see our role as helping to build the community understanding and the local mandate that supports councils to make the case for national reform. And together, we're building the public support needed for the federal government to act on a solution that communities increasingly recognise as both practical and fair. And so, since launching in March, 9 councils have now passed motions calling on the federal government to establish a climate compensation fund. And what's particularly encouraging is that these aren't all the same types of council. They're metropolitan, they're regional, they're rural, and they're councils that represent a whole different range of political makeups. And just last night, Bayside City Council joined the growing list of councils that have not just passed motions, but done so with unanimous support across all councillors. And that includes Mount Alexander Shire Council and City of Parramatta. And I think this demonstrates again that when the conversation is grounded in practical realities facing councils and the need for a fair long-term funding solution with support from the local community, that it's an issue that can bring people together across the political spectrum. And so, last slide, another important milestone came earlier this year at the Australian Local Government Association National General Assembly. The City of Sydney, through Deputy Lord Mayor Jess Miller, successfully moved a motion calling for a climate compensation fund to help address all of the challenges that we've just spoken about. And the motion was assessed as consistent with ALGA policy and adopted unanimously en bloc by the Assembly. And like the other hundreds of motions that are considered each year, however, it does not automatically become one of ALGA's priority advocacy campaigns. And we know that ALGA has a substantial advocacy agenda already. And for years, local government has been documenting the growing costs of climate change. So our opportunity now is to help shape the solution, not simply by asking for more funding, but by advocating for a fair way to pay for it. And so this is the call to you all, that as more councils pass motions and as support grows through state and territory local government associations, we're building a stronger, broader and more representative mandate for ALGA to adopt a polluter-paid climate compensation fund as a priority policy, but most importantly for the federal government to actually deliver it. So yes, this is not something that any one council can achieve by itself, but as every council joins this call, it strengthens the case for a national action, and we're hopefully really excited to work with you all on this together to achieve a fairer, more sustainable solution. So I'm now going to ask Elia Haig to speak, and Elia is a councillor with the Byron Shire Council, and Elia worked with a small team of local volunteers and led the charge in Byron Shire Council to become the 5th council to pass the motion in May this year. So welcome, Elia.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Millie. Great to see your presentation there. And yeah, thanks to the entire Communities for Climate Compensation team for this opportunity. It's such a great network to be a part of, and I'm keen to chat with any of the other councillors who are interested in getting involved. I'll also acknowledge I'm on Gadigal land today, but usually I'm based up north in the Byron Shire on Bundjalung country. And in acknowledging that we're meeting from stolen land, I just wanted to take a minute to reflect on how climate disasters disproportionately impact First Nations communities. I think it's such an important part of the conversation, and you know, they're a much smaller proportion of the national population, but then when you look at the proportion of disaster impacted communities, it's so often First Nations and Aboriginal communities right on the front lines of climate change. And we need to really centre that and consider that when we're talking about climate compensation. But yeah, as I said, I'm from the beautiful Byron Shire up on Bundjalung country, Rockwell land, and up in the Byron Shire, we have been living in a climate emergency for a long time. Like so many councils around the country, we've been exposed really to rolling climate disasters for a number of years now, reflecting back to 2019 and 2020, the bushfire season. Typically, the very wet northern rivers doesn't get exposed to bushfires, and for the first time, we saw precious subtropical rainforest catching fire. It was shocking for our community. It was incredibly environmentally destructive, obviously, as well, but it was a real indicator of what a climate crisis means. It means parts of the environment that have never burnt before burning. Of course, we had a cyclone last year. Cyclone Alfred hit it was an ex-tropical cyclone by the time it hit the coast, but that's not normal in New South Wales. It's part of the climate emergency, and of course the most I guess well-known climate disaster that we've experienced in recent years is the 2022 floods. So there was obviously catastrophic impact in Lismore and up the coast in Tweed and Murwillumbah, but in the Byron Shire we had thousands of homes flooded. Mullumbimby was particularly badly impacted. But it wasn't just the impact of the water rising. One of the major experiences of the floods in our shire was the way that the water moved with such high velocity through the smaller communities up in the hills. So we had huge numbers of landslides, of roads washing away. It was hundreds of millions of dollars of damage to council's infrastructure in one night. Let alone the community impacts to homes and businesses and residents. And I think what the recovery from this has shown is that the government systems and funding structures are not set up to respond when disaster is striking on this scale. We see that in the complexity of the funding structures. Council has to get out there and do quick and immediate repairs, and that's partly guaranteed by some money from the state, but then that money arrives later, and then the federal government money comes in as well. It's very complicated, and there are so many costs that are part of this recovery and reconstruction that end up being borne by council. So part of what Millie was pointing to there, the concept of betterment. If we want to build a piece of infrastructure back so it will be more resilient for the next disaster, that money has to come from council, which means it's coming from ratepayers. That money isn't coming from a state or federal grant. It has to come out of our already incredibly stretched budgets. And that's, just one small example of how that financial responsibility for something that is being driven by polluters, it's being driven by coal and gas, is falling on council and therefore falling on our communities and our ratepayers. I think the other thing that doesn't get talked about all that much, we talk about the big disasters and the major and extreme climate-driven disasters, but also the routine changes to the climate and how that is impacting council's budgets. So something that's a declared disaster, you might get the state and federal funding for, but what about just the fact that in the Northern Rivers we're experiencing higher rainfall more regularly? That's not a declared disaster. Well, that means more potholes. It means impacts to our drainage system. It means increased vegetation management. Or then looking at the other side on heat waves, well, that means higher air conditioning bills. It means maybe keeping our libraries open for longer so that people can access heat refuges and swimming pools, and all of these costs that sit outside of a declared disaster that we have no way to fund, that is falling on councils and communities as well. And it goes to that point of, well, who is creating this problem, it's not council, it's not the community, it's the polluters. Who should be paying? It should be the polluters. This is a moment for us to really harness, and I think the point that Millie was making about how we work across I guess what you would typically think of as a political spectrum. Like, this isn't just about climate and environment. This is about the impacts of disasters on financial sustainability of local government. And that is an incredibly quite a unifying thing to talk about. And you can find support across the community and across councillors with that discussion. I think we can all see what is happening around the country when it comes to the impacts of disaster on councils' budget bottom lines. And so using that as a way to talk to your other councillors, if you're thinking about putting one of these motions through, I would definitely recommend not engaging exclusively with your fellow councillors who care about climate and environment, but starting your engagement with your fellow councillors who can see the challenge of the cost shifting that's happening from state and federal government down to local government when it comes to disaster response. And actually on our council, that was the strategy that I took with talking to my fellow councillors. We have generally quite a progressive council. We have nine councillors, and this only went through 5-4. And the reason for that was I chose to work with a councillor on that concept of this is really challenging cost shifting coming from state and federal government onto councils. And the folk who chose not to vote for it was because they not because they don't think that climate not because they don't think that the climate emergency is happening. They do, they see it, they feel it as well, but they sort of played into the politicisation piece. And I think that is where engaging early and openly, using those different frames with your fellow councillors is really important. And so there's the template motion, which is fantastic. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but Communities for Climate Compensation has a template motion that you can take and make your own. I really enjoyed doing that as a way to sort of actually stop and take stock of what climate disasters are costing our communities. So, I got the numbers on what the costs are that are being borne by council, what are some of the actual values of what we're spending on responding to these disasters, what some of the betterment funding might have looked like. So if you're a council staff member or you have good relationships with your council staff, it's a great way to sort of start that conversation of what is this actually costing us, and using that to work with the template motion. And then, I can't stress enough how fantastic it is to work with your community on this as well. As we heard, there are so many community groups around the country who are getting a little bit of conversation coming through. Is someone off mute? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Can't stress enough to work with your community as well. There was a fantastic local community group working on this who put forward a petition to push council around moving this motion, and it was an incredible strength to be able to bounce off them and work with them to grow the campaign as well. And I lastly just want to reflect on the support that I got from Tipping Point. It was absolutely fantastic. It was as soon as we made the connection, Millie was available for me to have a chat with about the motion, about how I was crafting the motion, about the sort of strategy of working with the community as well. And as we got closer to the day that it came to council, we were able to have a bit of a media plan as well, and all of the engaging. We have a good relationship with the local media up in northern New South Wales. We're very lucky to have a strong local media, but engaging with the media on a statewide and national scale, that's not something I have the capacity to do as a local councillor, and it was amazing to have Tipping Point facilitating that. I had radio spots spots around New South Wales state. I think it was down in the Southern Highlands. They had me on to talk about how this was going, which shows actually the interest in this across the state, that the Southern Highlands wanted to understand why we were doing this in Byron and how it could apply in their local area as well. And yeah, we got some local media. We had the TV crew come down, and all of that was sort of able to be facilitated through a really cohesive campaign. And I think it's so important that as we add our voices to this call, that we move the motions, but we put the pressure on broadly too, and engaging with the media was a key part of that. It was also an opportunity for some members of our community to share their lived experience of what it means to be impacted by a climate disaster as well. So we had a local flood impacted community member who was willing to talk about what it means for council and community to be paying, and why a climate compensation fund would have made a difference for them recovering from the 22 floods. So look, at the end of the day, we know that this is such a wicked problem, and it's not really council's responsibility to it's so complex for us to solve. We need support, and a climate compensation fund, a pollution levy is a simple mechanism that allows us to prepare and respond to the emergencies that we know are just going to unfortunately keep rolling our way as the climate crisis grows. So I urge everyone to get behind it. If councillors online want to chat with how it went and the learnings, get deeper into the learnings and how they might apply to your council, I'm happy to chat. And thanks again for the opportunity to share a little bit about it today. Back to you, Millie.
Thank you so much, Elia. That was really wonderful to hear all about it, and also that advice of really starting engagement with fellow councillors early is really important, and also to speak to the importance of the community support and building broader support. We have a beautiful segue to speak to John Brennan, who is a long-time community advocate from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And his team of local volunteers not only got a successful climate emergency declaration through in 2021, but have been engaging with council through the Communities for Climate Compensation Network to try and get a motion passed on this campaign. So I'll hand over to John to tell us a bit more about that work that the network is doing to build that community support and work with councils. But thank you very much, Elia.
Thank you, Millie. And thanks everybody for taking the time to learn about our campaign to make the polluters pay. So my name is John. I'm a retired social worker, and these days I'm a volunteer community organiser. I live on the Sunshine Coast and pay my respects to the Gubbi Gubbi people who have preserved and protected country for millennia. So on the Sunshine Coast, we kicked off our campaign for a climate compensation fund in March this year. And our collaboration with council has been far easier than expected. Okay, we don't have an motion yet that's been passed council, but several of us were involved in the campaign to get council to declare a climate emergency, which was back in 2020. That campaign, while ultimately successful, had nothing like the support from council that we currently enjoy. And why is that? I think it's because the relationships between the community and the councillors have persisted now over 2 terms. Council has also seen the benefits of having made a climate emergency declaration, and possibly most significantly, council is under extreme financial pressure. Our council knows that it has a structural financial problem, and increasingly they see us as allies promoting a potential solution. It's a bit unusual for them to see us that way. It's a bit unusual for us to be seen that way, but there it is. The Sunshine Coast Council is predominantly conservative. In 2019, a newly elected non-aligned councillor, David, declared his support for a climate emergency declaration. So a close working relationship evolved between David on the inside and an active campaign in the community. I cannot overstate how critical it was to have a council champion, but equally our champion would have achieved not very much if not for the persistent and vocal community campaign. This time around, with the Make Polluters Pay job, council is not being cajoled by a noisy community. Rather, it's forging ahead while encouraging us to catch up. Shortly after Make Polluters Pay, Sunshine Coast sent letters to all of the councillors. The Mayor and another councillor agreed to meet with us. We were surprised when they encouraged us to mobilise public support and suggested who we might contact and even pointed out aspects of strategy. So why is a largely conservative Queensland council enthusiastic to make the polluters pay? In 2025, we were visited by Cyclone Alfred. The CBD of my town, which is Nambour, flooded 3 times in 45 days. Some businesses haven't returned and won't return. Beaches were eroded into cliffs, and you would likely have heard that Bribie Island was cut in two, with the ocean swell pouring into Pumicestone Passage and threatening the posh residences of Golden Beach. Some of the costs to council included unbudgeted outlays for road and beach repairs, but also there was staff unable to get to work and revenue foregone through waived dump fees and things like that. So the budget deliberations for the 2025-26 budget were really tense. And the budget actually wasn't finalised until July 2025, so it missed the end of the financial year. Residents and ratepayers were anxious that council would impose a disaster levy, as the Gold Coast Council did. However, that didn't happen, but rates were increased by 7.9%. When David, our council champion, spoke about the polluter pays concept at the June 2025 council meeting, the response was lukewarm. But what a difference the last 12 months has made. More budget strife, and now in 26-27 rates have increased by 9.7%. A freeze has been placed on hiring for over 50 vacant positions, and 80 staff have been made redundant in July alone, in the last month. Not all of council's financial woes are due to weather, but in the past decade, we've had the full menu of extreme climate events: floods, storm surge, drought, bushfires, and cyclone. And just what Elliot was saying about a bushfire in rainforest, we had bushfires on Wallam Heathland, which is, basically has its feet in water, but still it burnt for the first time. So when we met the Mayor in April, she was in the midst of budget deliberations, and the appeal of a climate compensation fund was pretty obvious and immediate. However, she also made it clear that for council to act, she needed demonstrated community awareness and community support, and that it was our job to bring that online. So since then, we've conducted regular community surveys. These conversations, they become conversations with random citizens at markets, down the beach, different sort of public locations. They generally end up being quite in-depth and demonstrate unqualified and near universal support for a climate compensation fund. We also get a bit of nonsense, whinges about what council's doing with the rates and all that sort of stuff, and some weird theories about climate change, but that you get that. So nationally, over 600 surveys have been completed. Locally, we've got hundreds of signatures on petitions, and we've had a little media coverage. Before we had the opportunity to present our survey results and petitions to the councillors, they voted unanimously to endorse the Make Polluters Pay motion at the recent Alga Assembly. So our next step is for council to pass its own Make Polluters Pay motion, but that means we've got to do a lot more community surveys, a lot more petition signatures, and a lot more interaction with councillors at public meetings and pop-ups. Before I finish, I'd like to mention a few things that may be obvious, but are still good to remember, I think, when building the community-council relationship. One I just mentioned, that is connecting with councillors in community settings like pop-ups or public meetings. We've found that councillors engage better in these settings than the formality of their chambers. Secondly, council staff are not all cut from the same cloth. When in 2020 we were stonewalled by senior staff and heads of department, we engaged the middle management and the admin people with a stunt that gave away coffee vouchers. This started a buzz around the offices that the senior staff couldn't ignore. Lastly, and not surprisingly, we found that councillors and staff respond to being affirmed and thanked. For example, we recently sent letters to our councillors congratulating them for endorsing the ALGA motion. Most responded gratefully. Finding ways to affirm council positions the community as allies and collaborators rather than whingers and whiners. We understand from councillors they get plenty of whingers and whiners. The credit for much of our approach goes to David, our man on the inside. So if you're a councillor or a council worker, please don't hesitate to advise your community campaigners. I'm sure they will appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and back to you, Millie.
Thank you so much, David. Sorry, David, I'm just listening to you talk about David Champ, the councillor, John. I was thinking about David's role as the champion. But yes, thank you for speaking about the community support that you're building, but I think also just like really painting a picture of what that important alliance between the community groups as part of the Communities for Climate Compensation Network and also councillors and council staff, and that relationship is what is going to help us to really grow the momentum of this campaign throughout the country. So I really want to just leave you all with some suggestions about your next steps before we go to questions, to give you some very concrete things that you can take away to contribute to the campaign if you have been inspired by Elia and John's words. So we've obviously spoken about the big scale of the problem, but as councillors, there are some really important and not huge things that you can do to make a difference on this campaign. So the first step is obviously bringing forward or supporting a motion. And as Elia mentioned, we do have a template motion that you can use and adapt, but we also have briefing materials and examples from other councils that have already gone through this process. And as Elia mentioned, she's happy to chat to people, but we also have a network of councillors who are working on this campaign and who are keen to connect with other councillors about this issue. And so there are lots of resources that we can provide to you to help do that. But as John spoke about, it's really important to have a champion councillor and then to build across party support to get the motion across the line. And so that does mean, and again, as Elia spoke about, speaking to fellow councillors before the vote, listening to staff advice, understanding the concerns and identifying the things that could get in the way of those of that support. And I think also it's not just supporting the council motion or being the champion and building cross council support, but also you can connect with the local group. The website is there, and we'll also put it in the chat. You can directly connect with a team that may or may not be active yet in your community, and ask them what they're up to. I can connect you directly with those groups, but there are a whole heap of individuals who are not yet teams who are keen to connect with councillors as well. So if they're not on the website, there are more people. But also connecting with other councils, not just in your council, but beyond, and sharing this campaign and encouraging others to take part. And talking about polluters paying in as many forums as you can, whether that be local media or your own council chambers. And as Elia and John mentioned, I think there are pushes in the state-based local government associations to try and get motions passed. So looking out for those motions and building that support would be amazing. And then the final thing is for those of you who are council staff, I know John spoke to that as well, that you also have an important role, and obviously that's around documenting costs, bringing together all of the information about disaster recovery costs, insurance costs, damaged assets, the staff time, the cash flow pressures, all of those things. We know that they are critical often to getting these motions passed, but often difficult to assemble. And other things are about supporting through reports. Often the process of getting the motion passed involves getting a report written first. So whether that's something that can be achieved first is really important. And then obviously post a motion, embedding that decision in policy and advocacy. And the template motion suggests that council write to not just the local federal MP, but also to the Federal Minister for Climate and Energy. So doing that follow through is also really important. So there are lots of different roles that you can do, and there are lots of active ways to be involved in the campaign. And obviously we really encourage you to do both. But I believe there's been a bunch of questions, so I will hand back to Sally.
Thank you, Millie, and thank you, Elia and John. That was really fantastic to hear from all of you. We have had some questions in the chat, and I will go through and ask those now. But also, if you've had a question on your mind, please feel free also to put your hand up, and we'll come to you when we can. I think some of these questions have already been answered. One that I noticed that was a question I had early on, so I think would be great for you to answer, Millie, in case other people are wondering the same thing. This one came from Michelle, who is actually my former host. Michelle asked, or commented first, that she totally agrees that polluters need to be appropriately taxed / penalised, and that there should be ongoing funding. But is there any risk of building some kind of reliance on polluters with this campaign linking so clearly the compensation fund to the polluters? I know that you've got a good answer for this, Millie, so take it away.
Yes, and it is something that has been thought deeply about, and it's why the rate of the cost of the levy put on the exports will increase over time to keep the funding amount stable for councils, but to incentivise the transition. And those being the two key pillars of things that we really think are important to phase out fossil fuels, but that we are not seeing this in the frame of for example, in Norway, they, have a very high tax on their oil and gas, and that is overwhelmingly seen by the population as something that funds their welfare state. We've been very deliberate in framing this as compensation for the damages that have already been done. So it's not about funding the things that it's about compensating for damage and assisting with transition. And that's the language that we're using, and it's also as part of a pathway to phase out. So the idea is not to become reliant on this funding, but simply to use it as a way to support communities that need it as we transition away.
And Millie, something that I heard from you early on as well was it's easy for us to forget, because of the circles that we move in, that mainstream Australia doesn't necessarily automatically link polluters to climate change. So just actually getting a much greater level of awareness and buy into that concept is also an important piece of the puzzle as well. Some other questions that we had in the chat. Thanks for that one, Michelle. Chilla asked, is there any value in reframing the proposal in terms of externality, so that kind of economic talk, in much the same way that we talk about cigarette companies and cancer costs and that kind of thing? I guess that's kind of built in a way, Millie, would you say?
Yeah, and I think, the way that we talk about the campaign really depends on the audience. I know that a lot of teams have done really great work talking in that kind of really economic framing, specifically lead to Liberal councillors who, for whom economic stability and the economic framing of issues is really important. And so, yes, in that instance, that's the framing that they're using. For others, they're talking about the fairness, and that's the thing that resonates with people. But I think the beauty of this campaign is that there are so many ways to talk about it in ways that make sense and that resonate with people. And so picking the frame that works best for whoever it is that you're talking to is the important thing to do. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Millie. There were a couple of questions for John in the chat. One was, could you tell us a little bit more about the coffee action, John, how that worked? And also, you mentioned 80 odd staff. I think that was in relation to them being made redundant. How many FTEs does your council have? So a couple about the staff at your council, John.
FTEs means full-time, is that right?
Yes.
I don't really know. I think it's probably around about 1,500. So it's a fairly big council. I think, I'm not sure. The stunt was a lot of fun. We set up a roulette wheel and we had 4 quadrants on it: bushfire, flood and something else, and declare a climate emergency. We set it up outside the council offices, several different locations, and as the staff arrived early in the morning, they got to spin the roulette wheel. If they landed on declare a climate emergency, they got a coffee voucher. That was much appreciated, and we had fun doing it and had some really good conversations. It really actually engaged a lot more of the middle staff and the admin staff, and we had sort of been banging our heads up against the heads of department without really getting to them, to be honest. So yeah, but I think stunts like that can be a really good way of cutting through if you just use some creative imagination and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Thanks, John. I'm aware that we're running out of time, but I might just ask 1 or 2 more questions. But obviously, if you have to go, you have to go, and you'll be able to catch up later if you miss the end. You mentioned already the Norwegian situation, Millie, but are there any other countries where this type of levy is already in place, or maybe they're moving towards that?
It's a great question. I know that there are obviously most countries do a better job of taxing their resources at a higher rate. So that as a starting proposition is certainly the case across the world. There are campaigns across the world calling for polluters to pay, and various mechanisms, policy mechanisms, whether that's a climate compensation fund or others that are being called for. In certain states in the United States, in Vermont, for example, they have recently got a similar to a climate compensation fund up, but none that I know of at a national level. But as I said, most countries do a better job of having higher tax rates and have a better input from fossil fuels or exports into their general revenue. But yeah, we're working across the broader international alliance of Make Big Polluters Pay to try and turn that around for lots of countries as we hasten the phase out.
Thanks, Millie. And I'm sorry, everybody, we haven't had time to get to every single question, but one that I might just leave Elia and Millie with is the one around, is there value in trying to get together those New South Wales councils who have already passed the motion to put that forward at the upcoming LG New South Wales conference?
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah, and I think now's the time to start looking towards that. It always sneaks up on us. The LGNSW conference is in a few months, but getting it through as many councils as we can in the next month or 2 will be really important to set up for the conference. And yeah, hopefully growing the number of councils that pass it in general in New South Wales as we approach that.
But yeah, not just New South Wales. All of the local government association conferences are happening in a few weeks' time in Tasmania through till December in South Australia. And so, yeah, if you're interested in getting motions up for those conferences, love to chat. And I know that, for example, there's work being done in WA to try and get the motion up at WALGA. There's work already being done at the Victorian level to already pass the A Polluters Pay motion in support of a climate compensation fund through the Victorian state body. So yes, there's work that's been done, but would love to connect with anyone that would like to do that more.
Great, thanks, Millie. All right, look, we might start wrapping up and we will thank our speakers properly in just a moment, but there's a few important messages before everybody trickles away. So I did mention before that you can get in touch with us in lots of different ways. And I noticed some people in the chat were talking about, could we have a council alliance around this campaign? I don't know if that's in the works, Millie, but you're certainly welcome to use the existing infrastructure of CEA. Many of you would be officers who are on our base camp. If you're not already on our base camp, I'd highly recommend getting on there. And you can also connect with us through our YouTube channel, so you can get notified of all these sorts of webinars. Follow us on LinkedIn. I've got my old email there. Apologies about that. But if you go to the contact page, you will reach us there. That is a quick little snapshot of what the base camp looks like. Basically, there are hundreds of people there every day swapping information. So get in on that. Some upcoming special events I wanted to mention as well, just in case there are any councillors on the call or senior leaders who have not heard about our training. I saw that we have several of our past graduates here on the call today, including Prapti and Joanna, and several people, Phoebe and Rebecca, maybe some others who are about to do the next course coming up starting on Monday. If you've missed all that and you suddenly want to jump in, get in touch with me straight away, please. Otherwise, you can hang out for the next one. We also have events just like this pretty much every month. We have quite frequent climate cafes as well. That's kind of an outlet for processing and venting all of your feelings about the climate. If you're a councillor or a council officer, you're always welcome to join us for that. So jump in there if that's something of interest to you. And I just also wanted to mention that we will be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the first ever climate emergency declaration in December this year. We've got some exciting stuff coming up, so please stay tuned for that. But the very first part of that is going to be a special webinar called 10 Years On, Why Should Councils Declare a Climate Emergency in 2026? Is it still relevant? Have people forgotten all about it? Was it a passing trend? What difference has it made? We heard from John today about the difference that it made on the Sunshine Coast. So please join us for that one, and that will just be the first of several different events. And with that, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Millie, to John, to Elia for speaking with us today and for sharing this amazing piece of work. And more than all that, just thank you for all the hard work that you've been doing. You've been having some fantastic success. It's wonderful to see. And thank you for sharing it with us. We'll certainly stay in touch, and you'll all receive a link to the recording, to the presentation, and I'm sure you'll be able to get in touch with Millie and co if you want to follow up. Millie, anything you want to finish on?
No, just big thanks for everyone for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elia. Thank you, John. It's been fantastic having you here today. And hey, perhaps we'll have another one in future when the campaign progresses a bit further.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
See you next time.